When we started this week, in the first lecture, I said there were probably two figures that were sort of the founding fathers of funk and black pop in the 1970s, one of them being Sly Stone. We've talked an awful lot about his music already, but we reserved discussion of James Brown until this video. So let's talk a little bit about James Brown and what was going on with him. Remember, back in week 6 of the first part of the course, we spent a lot of time talking about James Brown and his music and the way he came out of the 1950s into the 1960s and established this approach to his music that was very sort of groove-based and groove-oriented, with his interesting kind of aggressive yet absolutely unthreatening, non-threatening kind of vocal approach that often used sort of kind of outrageous phrases as kind of the key lyric. I mean, you wouldn't listen to a James Brown tune to get the seriousness of the lyrics. These are not singer-songwriter lyrics. So some of the tracks that we talked about back in week 6 of the first half of the class was Papa's Got a Brand New Bag from 1965 and I Got You, I Feel Good from 1965. He extended and sort of increased this interest in funk during the 1970s. Maybe you'll hear in that music more emphasis on the interlocking of guitar, drums, and bass into these very tight kind of rhythmic things. There's still plenty of horns in that music, but there's an increased sort of a focus on the groove. We could point to tunes like, for example, Super Bad from 1970, which was a #1 R&B hit, number 13 on the pop charts, or a track called The Payback from 1974. And I choose that one because there's a little bit of an interesting story that goes with it, vis-a-vis our talk about blaxploitation films in the previous video. The Payback was a #1 R&B hit, only went to number 26 on the pop charts, but it was written for a blaxploitation film called Hell Up in Harlem. But it was rejected by the people who are making the film as just being, oh, the same old James Brown thing again, like that. And so James got so upset about that that he actually released the track himself, but did actually do a couple of soundtracks for blaxploitation films, both of them in 1973, Black Caesar and also Slaughter's Big Rip-Off. So we see the blaxploitation thing coming back into the story as we talk about James Brown and the importance of his music. Anyway, the emphasis on this precision playing, where all the instruments sort of line up in, I would say mathematical, although in a mathematical way, except that makes it seem somehow that it's lifeless and heartless and cold, but that's far from what it is. Everything sort of locks together an intricate arrangement that's just filled with feel. And James Brown, his band's really the one responsible for establishing the model for that. Certainly that's where Sly Stone was coming from when he was putting his group together at the end of the 1960s. Maybe the most obvious influence of James Brown in the 1970s is the music of George Clinton and his group Parliament Funkadelic, or at one point his two groups, Parliament and Funkadelic. George Clinton in many ways blends together not only the stylistic elements of James Brown's music, but also, like Gamble and Huff did in Philadelphia, the kind of business approach of Berry Gordy. George Clinton is more than just a performing artist, songwriter, producer. He became a kind of impresario with not only the groups that he was, the two groups that he had, Parliament and Funkadelic, having them signed to different labels at the same time, but a whole bunch of other groups around, combinations of band members and things like that. So he was kind of running almost a small kind of production company there for a while, and was doing it extremely well. He was born in New Jersey, but he moved to Detroit in the 1960s and was kind of involved in the Motown scene. Did work with Motown for a little while, but mostly was in Detroit doing a similar kind of thing to Motown, but his records were often released on other Detroit labels. He performed with a group called the Parliaments, whose maybe their biggest hit was probably from 1967, a track called I Wanna Testify, #3 on the R&B charts, #20 on the pop charts. But due to a dispute over the name The Parliaments, he started recording using the name Funkadelic. Well, after the legal dispute was resolved, he then owned the rights to both names, Parliament and Funkadelic, and so decided he would have two groups. The one called Parliament would be the more commercial of the two groups, and Funkadelic would be maybe the more sort of experimental, the one sort of to try out a lot of sort of crazy and new ideas. The Parliament group released their first album called Osmium in 1970 on the Detroit label Invictus, which was run by Holland Dozier Holland, the songwriting team from the 1960s who've been responsible for so many hits for groups like the Four Tops, the Supremes, Martha and the Vandellas. They'd broken with Berry Gordy at the end of the 60s, and now they had their own label, and here was George Clinton's group Parliament doing their debut album there. But the next one, for the next album in 1974, Up for the Downstroke, they moved to Casablanca Records. Berry Gordy got the group signed, George Clinton got the group signed with Neil Bogart. Now, Casablanca was an interesting label because not only did it have Donna Summer on it, who would later become an important figure in disco, but also the band Kiss. So Casablanca was a label that really knew how to promote artists, and so Up for the Downstroke with Parliament was released with them, and the title track, Up for the Downstroke, made it to number 10 on the R&B charts. Well, and the big album is probably the album Mothership Connection. That's the one that's often cited by music historians as being the representative album. And the big song, the representative song, if you want to hear sort of a Parliament kind of track, would be Tear the Roof Off the Sucker, Give Up the Funk. And that's a track that's almost entirely about the groove. I mean, very little going on in terms of lyrics there. It's almost entirely, you can really hear the James Brown influence, the Sly and the Family Stone influence. It all really sort of comes together there. George Clinton put together an elaborate stage show for Mothership Connection, where there were costumes. There was actually a spaceship that cast flying saucer that sort of came down from the top of the auditorium onto the stage, and he came out of it, and there was smoke and all this kind of thing. You got to remember, 1974, 75, 76, this was really sort of sophisticated stuff. And when we think about it from that point, a sort of a concept that drove the stage show and all that, we're reminded of groups like Alice Cooper or David Bowie or Genesis doing similar kinds of things in the white rock scene at the same time. So the interesting thing about Mothership Connection and some of the other stuff is that there's always a sense of irony in humor. You could never say that George Clinton was pretentious or taking himself too seriously. There was always a sense that they were just having fun with these ideas. But anyway, an important artist from that point of view. I want to close this lecture just talking a little bit about a group called the Average White Band. As much as I've said about James Brown, George Clinton, and his groups, again, these are groups that you were not likely to hear on FM rock radio. You may have been aware of them, you may have heard them, you may have had friends turn you on to the albums, but you weren't likely to hear them on FM rock radio so much. There was a group, however, that played in the same general style that these guys are playing in, the funk style, that you would hear, and that was a group called Average White Band. These guys were formed in Scotland in 1972, and they were a white band, not an African-American group. Their second album, AWB, was a #1 album in this country in 1974. The track Pick Up the Pieces, a #1 hit single. And there's a case where that track, Pick Up the Pieces, was played on rock radio a lot. At least growing up in Detroit, where I was, I heard that a lot. George Clinton, not so much, right? Cut the Cake. The next album from 1975, #4 on the pop charts, #1 on the R&B charts. The title track, Cut the Cake, was a #10 hit and a #7 R&B track. So the Average White Band, one of those groups that, again, stood for what white listeners thought must be going on in black pop, although, again, most white listeners didn't know much of the music that we're talking about this week. Well, let's turn now to a consideration of reggae music and what was happening with Jamaica in the early 1970s.